Now in this video, we are going to be diving into keyframing specifically within the Edit tab. Now, if you're coming from Premiere Pro, you're used to having your own dedicated keyframe window. Now in DaVinci Resolve, we don't have that. All the keyframing is done in the timeline itself, which I actually prefer and is the method that I would use in Premiere as well. Keyframing is one of those things that is very, very important to understand from the ground up so that you can use this to your advantage to make your edits the best that they can possibly be. I would say that having a deep understanding of how keyframes work and how you can manipulate them to get your desired effect is one of the most important things that you can learn as an editor. So with that being said, let's jump into DaVinci. I'm going to show you guys exactly how I use keyframes. So I'm in my timeline here and we have this clip of a long border riding down this mountain here. And if I go up to my inspector panel up here, we can see that there are tons of different parameters that I can play with for my selected clip, right? I could change the zoom, I could change the position. And now let's say we want to change these parameters over time. What can we do? Well, that's what these keyframes here on the side are for. We can click these keyframes to basically enable the writing of keyframe data for the specific parameter. So if we want to be changing the value of the zoom over time in our clip, what we're going to want to do is click that little keyframe next to zoom and we can see that it goes red. Basically, when the keyframe next to the parameter is red in the inspector window, that means that that parameter, we can now create keyframes for it throughout our clip here. So we've created that keyframe, but how can we see it on the clip itself? Now we can see that there's two buttons here in the bottom right corner of our clip. We can see that they are on this clip, but they're not on this clip or this clip. The reason those two icons are there is because we've already created a keyframe on our clip. So if I click Command Z, if I undo that, those two little icons are gone. They're only going to show up once we've already created a keyframe for any one of the parameters on our clip. So let's set a keyframe here. And let's explore what these two little symbols here do. If we press the little keyframe at the end, we have the keyframe editor here. Another way to access the keyframe editor with the Ravenclaw shortcut is Command-Shift-C. That will bring down this little editor here, and it shows us our keyframes on like a timeline underneath our clip. So let's move forwards in time. So we know that this keyframe here holds a value of 1 and 1 for the X and Y axis of the zoom. If we move forwards on the clip, and let's say we want to change it, all I did was zoom in. I just changed that parameter, and we can see that a keyframe was already added. I didn't have to click the keyframe button again. That's because we've turned keyframing on for this parameter. So we can move anywhere on the clip and make changes to that parameter, and it will record what change we've made on that specific time where our playhead is. We can also make the change instead not by changing the parameters here, but we can also click on this button here to change the scale, and now we can make changes like this to the scale. We can zoom out so that we can go like that, and it's going to record that scale parameter at that stage as well, simply just by selecting the transform tool here in the bottom left of our preview window. So now if I take my playhead and I scrub through my clip, we can see that the size of our clip is changing throughout time. Now let's say we want to keyframe more than one parameter. Let's say we also want to keyframe the position and the rotation. So we can press that keyframe button wherever we want to set these values at. So we set them here. But the thing is, why are we only seeing one keyframe here? We've now set keyframes for 3 different parameters, but we're really only seeing one little timeline here. And that's where we're going to want to press this little arrow here to expand the keyframe editor. I'm just going to shrink the audio tracks here so we have more room to see things. And now we can see all the individual timelines for the individual parameters. We have zoom X, zoom Y, and we have position and rotation angle. So we've just created these 3 keyframes here. Let's play around with the position as well. So if we move the position parameters, if we change them, we can see that a new keyframe has been created. We can also move it in here as well, since we have the transform button selected here. If you don't have the transform button there, you can simply just press the drop down here and select transform. We can move in a different spot in time, move this over. And the same thing goes for the rotation as well. We can see as soon as we change that over there, the rotation keyframe was added right there. So all we're doing is assigning a specific value for each parameter at a specific point in our timeline. That's all that our keyframe really does. And you can see that this looks like chaos. There's a lot of randomness going on here, but this is just for demonstration purposes. You guys can see how we can add multiple different keyframes for multiple different parameters on the same clip. Now, what we can also do is add effects to our clip and create keyframes for those effects. So for example's sake, let's say we want to blur this clip, but we don't want the whole thing to be blurred. We just want to blur it towards the end. We want it to gradually blur. Let's drag this box blur effect onto our clip here. And now we have the effects little tab in the inspector enabled. And same thing, just like the parameters that we have in video, we also have parameters that we can change on this effect with the little keyframes here on the side as well. So let's say that at this point of my clip, actually, let's just rotate this back over to a normal position here so we can see what's going on. So I'll just change this to 0, and we can see that that's added a rotation keyframe. So let's say that at this stage, we want to have the blur set to 0, and then we want it to blur out at the end. So what we can do is select the keyframes for both of these parameters here. Now we've added our box blur effect to our clip, but we can't see the keyframes for it in the keyframe editor. We can bring up the curve editor by pressing Shift-C on our keyboard. That is the Ravenclaw shortcut for that. And in here, we can see all of our keyframes on a graph here. And in the top left corner, we're able to select what properties we want to see in this graph. So because we have box blur added as an effect in our inspector, we can choose these options here. So we are wanting to animate the horizontal strength and the vertical strength here. So we're just going to select both of those, make sure those are selected. And let's just uncheck everything else just so that we can focus on those two alone. So down here, we have this line here. If we drag this line up, we can see things get blurrier. If we drag it down, things get back to normal. We can see that this one line is affecting both the horizontal and the vertical strength. So what we can do is set a keyframe here on our curve editor by holding Alt or Option on the keyboard and clicking down on that line. Now we've created a keyframe on this line. It's the same kind of keyframe as the keyframes up here, pretty much the exact same thing. It's just a circle instead of a little diamond. And we can do the same thing further down the line. So let's just hold Alt or Option, click on there, and now we can move these keyframes however we want in here. So if I scrub my playhead forward, we can see that the value of the horizontal and vertical strength of the blur starts at 0 right here, and it moves to a value of 0.43. So in our curve editor, we were able to create keyframes just like in the keyframe editor right up above. Now, for all of these properties that we're seeing up here at the top, we can also view them down here in the curve editor as well. Simply by clicking that little arrow in the top left, we can deselect both of those, and we can select all of these other ones that we have over here. So we have zoom, zoom Y, position, position Y, rotation angle. And we can view all of those different parameters down here. We can also click on them in the keyframe editor, and it will show us the graph version of it down below. Now, seeing our keyframes in this graph down here, or the curve editor, is great because it allows us to make changes to the individual keyframes. So we can see here that the way that the value here is being animated is it's very linear. Things are going straight into the keyframe, and then it starts to go up right away. There's no gradual transition between the change in both of these values. It's immediate as it hits the keyframe. Then that's linear. And in most situations, if you want things to look professional, you're gonna wanna smooth out that transition between the animation of the different keyframes. Now, the way that we can do that is by using these buttons up here, and they basically allow us to change the transition from one value to another. So if we select our keyframe here, we can see that this is selected, and this is the linear option. It's just a line. If we want to smooth things out, we can select this button here, and it'll smooth both the in and out point. It'll ease in and ease out. So let's press that, and we can see that this line, it doesn't just shoot up right away to the next keyframe. It keeps going forwards and then gradually goes up. Now let's just try to zoom in here so you can get a better image of that. The line is flat, and then it's still flat past the keyframe, and then gradually starts to go up to that next keyframe. Now we've selected ease in and ease out, but it defaults to just the ease out option because there is no keyframe previous to this keyframe. So we can see that it's eased out that keyframe. Now we can also see that we have this handle here. If we click and drag it, we can manipulate that curve even more. This would be an example of an extremely harsh transition from one value to another. It would basically go from normal to abrupt. There's no gradual change in this. It's almost an instant change, and it's very jarring. But this is an example of something that would be a lot smoother. It continues at the same velocity, the same kind of angle here, and then gradually goes up. And if we extend this handle, it will essentially extend the length of time it takes to transition from one value to another. Now, this looks chaotic here, and I'm just gonna reset this clip. So what I can do is just hit Command-Shift-X or right-click and select Remove Attributes. Command-Shift-X is the shortcut for Remove Attributes. I'm just gonna select everything, click Apply, and now we've reset this. So let's just focus on one parameter just to clarify things here. So let's have zoom keyframed here. We'll set that there, and we can hit Shift-C and Shift-Command-C to show us both of these editors. And let's just zoom in over here. Now let's actually hit the position keyframe as well, because I'm going to want to not just zoom into his chest. Let's zoom into his face here. Probably not something I would actually do in this case with this clip, but it's just for demonstration purposes. Let's go back to the beginning here, and let's set the position. Let's actually reset the position here by just selecting both of these, setting them to 0. Now we can see our clip animates from the original position and scale to a zoomed in look towards the end. Now if we just play this, we can see that we have this little abrupt push at the beginning, and at the end, it's not smooth. Now, I would never allow that in any of my videos because it looks jarring. It doesn't look good. So what I'm going to do in the curve editor is select these points and change them from a linear transition to a smooth one. So I'm just going to smooth that one out, smooth this one out, and we can see that we have this nice curve here. Now, this is for the zoom X. Now we can see that the same thing has been applied to the zoom Y. Now let's also apply a gradual transition to the position as well. So we can just, instead of it being linear, we can change that to smooth here. Now we can see, because we've smoothened out the keyframes for the position, we are exposing a bit of the background, and that's because the way that it's being animated is it's a gradual position change, and then it speeds up later on. So we're seeing the background here. So an easy way to fix that in this situation is just to spread out those keyframes, allow the image to scale in more before we make any more dramatic position changes. And we can start that position keyframe a little bit later on as well. So we're already zoomed in a little bit, and then the position changes. Now in this situation, we can't have the helmet in the center of the frame the entire time, because if we just move the image here, we can see that his head is cut off over there. But we did manage to make things feel a lot smoother by smoothing out the keyframes in the curve editor down here below by changing the type of keyframe from a linear one to a smooth one. Now, what's important to understand in the curve editor in this graph area here is that these keyframes here, when we drag them left and right, we are changing the time at which they sit on the timeline. This is the same thing. We're moving them here left and right on the timeline. And when we move them up and down inside of the curve editor, we are changing the value of that parameter. So we can see as we move up here, the position moves left. As we move down, the position moves right. And this is the position X. So same thing, like position Y, if we move up, the image moves up. If we move down, the image moves down. So up and down, moving these keyframes up and down changes the value of the parameter. Moving them left and right just changes where they sit on the actual timeline of your clip. Now, sometimes when you're clicking and dragging on a keyframe, it can be hard to just stay in one place. So what you're always going to want to do when you're moving keyframes around is to hold shift before you actually click and drag the clip. So let's say I want to move this keyframe left and right down here. I'm going to hold shift, and now I can move it left and right without worrying about it moving up and down. It's only moving left and right. Same thing for up and down. I'm going to hold shift, and then I'm going to start moving it up and down. And now I can know that I'm moving it up and down on that exact same point on my timeline, and I don't have to worry about it moving around on the timeline. I'm only changing the value of that parameter. So let me just reset this really quick again, Command-Shift-X. I'm just going to remove all the attributes here. Now, let's say I want to animate a bunch of these parameters over time within my clip. What I can do, instead of clicking each one of these keyframes individually, is I can just click the keyframe at the top, and it will create a keyframe for all the parameters within this one section. And if we go down here, click Command-Shift-C, we can see our keyframe editor. And if we zoom out here, we click that little drop down arrow, we can see that we've created keyframes for all of the different parameters there. And now if we move forwards in time, we can play around with these different parameters. Let's zoom in. Let's change the position. Let's change the rotation. Just by playing with them, we are recording new keyframes just by changing these different parameters here. And it's going to transition between the original keyframes and the ones that we've created later on in the clip. So I'm just going to remove all this from my clip, Command-Shift-X, apply, and we're back to where we started. Now, one thing I want to mention before we wrap up this lesson is that you can create keyframes in all of these bottom tabs except for the first and the last one. You can create keyframes in the Cut tab, in the Fusion tab, in the Color tab, and in the Fairlight tab where you do all of your audio stuff. But in the Cut tab, we're able to open up the inspector in the top right, and we have that same function here. We can see that we have the keyframes over here, and we can set keyframes at certain times within our clip and make adjustments, and we can see those animations between the keyframes unfold. The only thing is you're not able to access the curve editor in the Cut tab or even the keyframe editor. So to me, there's not as much of a point in setting keyframes in the Cut tab. I've been doing all of my keyframe stuff in the Edit tab. You can do that though, that is an option, but I like to right away just smoothen out my keyframes and set them in the way that I want to in the curve and keyframe editor, just to get that out of the way right away. But it's good to know that that is an option. Also in Fusion, we're able to set keyframes in there as well. It's a little bit different, and Fusion has its own layout, which is different than the Cut tab or the Edit tab. So the keyframe video for Fusion is going to be in the Fusion section of this course. Same with the Color tab and Fairlight as well. But the Cut tab and the Edit tab, the way that we set the keyframes in the inspector is pretty much the same. But in the Edit tab, we have more options as to how we can view and change our keyframes. So that's it for this video. I definitely recommend that you guys open up DaVinci, throw some clips in there, and experiment with keyframes so you can start getting the hang of it and you can start building up that experience. So when it's time to actually play around with keyframes, you know exactly what you're doing. But that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, and I'll catch you in the next one.